Hey everyone! Happy Monday! So, I'm gonna wait for a few people to pop on. How is your week going? Hi Matt, good to see you. Hi Tammy, good to see you. So, just gonna wait for a few more people to pop on, but I wanted to say I'm really excited about the conversation tonight that I'm going to be having with my good friend and fellow counseling psychologist, Dr. Tammy Oluyori. So we're going to be talking about working and understanding the inner critic. So if you are like me or anyone else that I know, I think the inner critic is something that we all have dealt with at some point in our lives, and it's so important to understand it and to work with it, right? So we're going to be talking about that tonight. It's going to be about 45 minutes, maybe a little bit longer. We're going to have some opportunity for Q&As at the very end. So if you do have any questions, you can pop your questions in the comments and we're going to address it. But tell us where you're from if you're tuning in. Hi, Dave Fincham. I see you're tuning in. And we're going to get started very, very soon. So do you say hello as you're popping on and tell us where you're from? So one thing that I want to just say before I bring Tammy on is that in both of our work we've noticed that the inner critic is something that is so common. So we definitely want to normalize that, and we also know that it's not always about completely eliminating it, but it's how do we work with it, right? How do we work with that inner voice that comes up, especially if we really want to go after some things that we want to accomplish, or we want to really create those desires that are so dear to us, and we have that inner voice that comes up and stops us. And I see Dave here. Yeah, we met through Carl. I remember you. Good to see you on here. And Matt, good to see that you're tuning in from Austria. So for those of you that are popping in that don't know me, I'm a counseling psychologist, and I've also recently ventured into film production myself. So very much aware that it's a new industry and that there's a lot of definitely inner criticisms or inner doubts that can come up when you're putting yourself out there creatively as a creator. So I think it's, again, super important if you're in these industries as well, that you really are able to work with that inner critic when it comes up. So give us some hearts as well as we're speaking if you tune in and you find that what we're sharing is of value. So I'm gonna see if I can bring on Dr. Tammy now. Hi, Gavin. Good to see you. So give me a minute because it's been a while since I've done Instagram, but I'm gonna bring Dr. Tammy. Okay, just give us a minute. There we
Hi.
go. Hi. Good to see you.
Good to see
Welcome,
you too.
welcome, Dr. Tammy. So I'm so excited about having you on tonight and having this really juicy conversation about the inner critic.
I'm excited too. Hi, everybody.
Yeah, people are popping on, so we might get more people come on
Mhm.
as I continue. So tell us a little bit about yourselves, because I've said a few things about you, but what can we know about you, and how is the inner critic connected to your work?
Oh, I'm I'm Tammy. Oh, sorry. I like my phone fell. My phone fell. I need to make sure that it doesn't happen again. So yeah, I'm Tammy. I'm a counseling psychologist and I'm based in Manchester. And I work with trauma and particularly helping people find a sense of self after trauma. And I think I've never not met someone, even before I specialized working in trauma. All the work that I've done, way before niching into really like working with complex traumas, always had trauma, trauma's always been involved. And I don't think I've ever worked with someone who hasn't had an inner critic
Mm-hmm.
as part of their trauma, their presentation. Um, so it's always at the forefront, but I think I particularly developed interest in working with inner critic when I trained in compassion focused therapy,
Yeah.
because it's the type of modality that works with people's parts. It's the approach sort of kind of would often identify that we all have different parts of us. Often our parts can be emotions, thought, or a combination of that. And that's when I took interest in sort of kind of working with specifically within a critic. But even before then, I worked in eating disorder, and that presentation also has quite heavy inner critic as part of what people experience. And I think I've learned a lot over the years in the ways in which I've approached it. I think initially it's often trying to sort of, I found that my practice would typically go in a battle with the critic, and sort of, the typical CBT approach would be to try and help people find ways in which they can build more capacity
Mm-hmm.
to to manage, sort of kind of like to develop more adaptive thought processes. But I think my working within a critic in a criticism's changed since, I trained in compassion focused therapy and other therapeutic modalities that sort of kind of identify and sort of kind of use path work, like IFS as well.
Mm-hmm.
And and also working with my own inner critic as well.
Yeah.
I would say change that for me. I think going into a relationship with my critic and really understanding the roots of it. So, the most transformative approach that I know with working with inner criticism is not combating it. It's not in trying to argue with it. It's first
Mm-hmm.
in trying to understand it, to really understand that, okay, you have this perspective. Say, for example, my own inner critic is right. Okay, so you have this perspective about this thing. You have this idea that, well, I'm not good enough when I make mistakes, or like, I
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't have said that. And rather than just offering myself cold compassion, like, oh, I should have, it became like a battle trying to force compassion without trying to really understand that part of me and why it was showing up for me. And that's the same way in which I work with my clients as well.
Mm-hmm.
And in getting into a relationship with my own critic is really understanding, actually, like, it does have roots. It has roots in experiences, actually. Like, I found more recently, when I was recently in therapy, my self-critic hasn't gone away, but by any chance, but definitely we have a better relationship now. We have a relationship where my critic doesn't make decision even if he disagrees with whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of kind of, I will listen to you, but I will only make decision when I start to sort of kind of feel better, when I feel physically better. And I would acknowledge you, but I won't believe you.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And more recently,
Yeah.
when sort of kind of like, obviously being a mom, and you get so many things wrong, and my
Mm-hmm.
self-critic showed up in that sort of area of my life as well, especially when I would sort of get things wrong with my son, and it would be like, you shouldn't have done that, you're going to sort of, you're being a bad mom. And I was working through those critical thoughts, and actually realized that it had roots in kind of something that came up more recently is sort of my mom. My mom was quite critical about me making mistakes. So that's something that I uncovered, as part of sort of kind of like this relationship with my critic. So our critic often, they have roots. And I think the most transformative, getting to understand their roots, isn't it? They're able to, rather than when they um maybe, I say combated with sort of compassion, or sort of trying to get rid of them, that can create more
Definitely.
internal,
Definitely.
yeah.
There's a little bit of a breakup, but I hopefully everybody's heard. what Tammy's been saying, and
Sorry,
really,
I think
really
my
excited to
internet
really
might be
work
also breaking a
work
little bit
alongside
because
it and to
whatever
really
reason my
understand
Wi-Fi
it.
decided not to
We just
work.
lost you there
Just
for a sec, but I think you're back now. So
okay.
um, I think
Yeah. Hold on. Back. Is it better? Sorry, I think my Wi-Fi. I lost my Wi-Fi connection. Oh, I should have better connection now because I've changed back to
okay.
Wi-Fi.
We'll work with it. We'll work with because what you're saying is so fascinating. And I think it might be worth just identifying, like, when we're talking about yeah, what is the inner, what is that inner voice inside of us? So, while, yeah, I think, yeah,
Sorry, say that again,
okay.
Kasia,
Are you
because
there?
I'm here with you, but it's breaking up your end
Okay,
as
while
well.
Tammy's working on this, I'm just going to add a few points. Absolutely, we have to first, my inner, like, that voice I am hearing inside of my head. What does it tell me, and where is it coming from? A critic can be a voice that maybe we have heard. It could be a critical parent. It could be someone.
Mhm,
A
mhm,
past voice that I used to hear externally, like mine, or maybe a teacher, or maybe it was I was in a relationship with, and and there was a very critical voice that I heard that internally it's become my own critical
mhm,
voice. Yeah, so I
mhm.
think to
Yeah,
understand
absolutely.
what is my own.
Mhm. I can hear you. Yeah,
Yeah,
can
and
you
that
hear me?
parenting
Can
can
you hear
really
me?
test us and bring out just so true.
Can you hear me, Kasia?
I can hear you. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
I can
okay. I
hear you.
just wanted to make sure that you can. It was still a bit jumpy. No, absolutely. I agree with everything that you said there. I think you broke it down really well. In sort of, having that inner inquiry. One exercise that I get my clients to do is really mapping out. Take your time to understand your critic through observation. Really thinking, what does this part of me sound like? Right? um if this part of me had a face, what would it look like? What's the tone of voice? What's the pace? Is it fast? Is it slow? Is it condescending? How does it show up? And that's sort of kind of like that engages us in having,
Mm-hmm.
sort of kind of building that relationship with the critic, really
Mm-hmm.
getting to understand, what does it sound like? Sometimes I can throw a question or before I even throw the question out there, I don't often ask that question because I don't lead client on. I want them to really understand this part of them. I've never found anyone struggle with this exercise ever, in sort of kind of like really taking time and slowing down with the critic. The critic shows up in the session. Sometimes I talk to people's critic. Most time I get people to talk to their critic. depending on what model I'm working from. And the critic wants to engage. Actually, like that part of us wants to be known. Is doing a job every day. Of course, it's part of our system, it's part of our inner world. And he does such a great job. Now, I mean, like, not
Mm,
necessarily a great job, but he works so hard. It's a part of us that works so hard, right? Um, so, the reality is this part wants to engage, wants to be acknowledged, wants to be seen, actually, wants to know that actually is doing a job, and we want to understand what role it plays. So it's never difficult for people to get into that work. When we're doing that, is really sort of kind of building that relationship, well, and sometimes people would directly know, like when they start to slow down with the critic, like, oh, actually this sounds like my dad, or this sounds like my mom. That was an epiphany for me. Like, part of my sort of kind of
mhm.
critical system recently was like, with my son, was like, that's not me. That's my mom, like, particularly. And, it was very much easily then linked to memories of, like, breaking plates or like a window. I was a very clumsy kid. So my mom had a
Mhm.
lot of like, why did you do that? And,
Mhm.
that came up for me recently. And so for many people, when we have that slow down, because of course, our inner critic is there, we're going about our day at how many miles an hour, and people just sort of kind of come to find that they have this part of them when they are particularly
Yeah.
overwhelmed or they're struggling, like I beat myself up. Most of the time people don't even notice it, but most of the time people can identify that I'm very critical. My being quite critical holds me back in the work that I do, or I don't show up for this or that. Or most of the time people don't know that the critic is part of their inner system. They just come with the thought processes, and
So
you're able
normalized.
to,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Mm,
So it's really slowing down and
mm,
getting to that place where we're able, obviously, therapy. This is why therapy or coaching is quite useful here, because you have another person who helps you um, really evaluate this part of your inner world and your inner landscape. It's nice to do with people, like, in my own sort of kind of recent therapies, like someone was being there with that voice with me. So this voice that sort of criticizes you every
mm,
time you get something wrong
mm.
with your son. Let's stay with that voice. Let's be with that voice. Let's understand that voice. And quickly that insight came. Actually, that's not me. That
Yeah.
doesn't sound like my voice. So yeah, really sort of kind of coming into that relationship with it, slowing down. And I think scientifically, if we're looking here into neuroscience and we're looking at the polyvagal theory and we're looking at window of tolerance and what's happening in the body when our critic is showing up, oftentimes, and not sort of kind of like exclusively, when we're sort of kind of being quite critical, that's usually when we're outside our window of tolerance as well. And with
Yeah.
most people, the
Mm,
sensation, the physiological sensation that's activated, some inner critic can be remnants of sort of kind of when we're in the hyperarousal state. Some inner critic are very fizzy
mm.
and usually sort of kind of like, work hand in hand with our anxious and angry states. And so sort of kind of like is useful to sort of kind of map that out as well. Like, when this critic is showing up for me, what what is that like? What sort of kind of physiological states am I in?
Yeah, because I think what you're saying is that oftentimes when we're more vulnerable
Mm-hmm.
to having that inner critic be very loud when
Mm-hmm.
we've gone through a difficult experience, or we're about to take a risk, or we've we're afraid of something, and we're sort of, we want to do something, but there's fear that comes up, and it's just about identifying, yeah, that there's going to be times when it's going to be louder, and again, to really be compassionate with ourselves in those moments, isn't it, that
Mm-hmm.
we're identifying that, I'm feeling quite vulnerable right now, so
Mm-hmm.
this is why my inner critic
Mm-hmm.
is more
Mm-hmm.
loud.
Yeah.
I've noticed Gavin's written about going to the gym.
Mm-hmm.
He would always criticize his image. 10 months in, he's feeling better physically thanks to the critic, so it's
Mm-hmm.
motivated him, but he still criticizes himself when it comes to failed
Mm-hmm.
relationships. And I
Mm.
want to
And I think that's very important,
point out that
actually.
oftentimes,
Um,
Yeah, go
No,
ahead,
you
Tammy.
go. No, I was going to say that's more reason to get to understand our critic because
Mm,
there's a problem that they were solving, right? Our critic do hold up, um, what is it? Like they hold up roles, in trying to help us. I don't think I've ever met any critic that hasn't showed up as a way of either trying to motivate people towards solving things. And sometimes critics have been very useful. There were periods when these voices in us have pushed us into doing things that have allowed us to survive. And I think that's why approaches that doesn't necessarily acknowledge the critic and go straight into trying to get rid of it might
mm,
actually sort of have lesser effectiveness than approaches that invite us in into really understanding and being with, when our critics started to show up and sort of kind of the valuable roles that they hold in our life. So yeah, they can sort of kind of motivate us to get here. We need to acknowledge that. Like, my critic motivates me to do well at school. My critic was
mm,
really useful because I was in education for 28 years. Of course, my
mhm,
critic was useful those days that I don't want to get out of bed and I don't want to do my, assignments or coursework or whatever. Like, it was very useful. So it does
mm.
hold useful role. I think it's very important to acknowledge
Yes.
that.
Yes, and I think in terms of like relating to what you're saying, I think one of the things that I've noticed in myself in the past as well is the critic would really drive me towards perfectionism,
Mhm,
right? So sometimes it can be the sense of like things have to be perfect, or
mhm,
you end up working too much because you think
mhm,
I have to do more, I have
mhm,
to achieve more, I have to accomplish more.
mhm,
And so sometimes it can also be a bit subtle in that you think it's not really criticism, but it's
mhm,
actually it's a subtle way of questioning yourself, or it's a subtle
mhm,
way of having that voice tell you, well, are you sure you can do this? Are you
mhm,
ready? Are you good enough to do this? Like
mhm, mhm,
it can show up in so many different ways, and
mhm,
sometimes it also can be very particular where we might feel really confident in one area, just as Gavin was saying, maybe in one area of our life we feel really confident, but then in
mhm,
another area we actually have a lot of fear, and that's where
mhm.
the critic will also show up, right? It's like maybe
Yeah.
your relationships are great, but maybe in your career you're feeling that fear of failure,
Mhm,
and you think, oh, I don't know if I can do this, and there's a lot of inner criticism that can
mhm,
come up. So
mhm,
it's
mhm,
really important just to acknowledge, I think, that
mhm.
there isn't, yeah, like a one size, like a one type of critic, because I think
No.
people are so individual, and
Mhm, mhm,
it's about, as you're saying, tuning in and really first identifying like what is that little voice inside my head telling
mhm,
me,
mhm.
and how
Yeah,
is,
yeah. Who is my critic? Who is my
yeah,
critic? And you can have more than one as well. You can have more than
you,
one type of, yeah, you can have different type of experiences. So really
mm,
like that slowing down and getting to know your critic is very, very important and
mm,
transformative.
mm. And Matt's saying his critic shows up when he speaks German, so it can show up in all kinds of ways. So
Mm-hmm,
yes,
mm-hmm,
it rears its head. And
mm-hmm,
I'm curious, so as we begin to understand our inner critic and we begin to look at how it affects our self-esteem and how it might prevent us from like really going out there and stepping out and going after our dreams, after our goals, or being able to
mm-hmm,
be vulnerable or
mm-hmm,
take risks. So
mm-hmm,
how how have you found that, if people are just starting on this journey and they're sort of like, I really want to know what I can start to do to not let that inner critic stop me, or to not like fear that if I put myself out there, um, people are going to judge me, because it's
mm-hmm.
always connected to those fears.
Absolutely,
So,
absolutely, absolutely. That's a very, very important one. And this is why we start with getting to know our critic. Because when
mm,
we start to get to know our critic, we start to learn that our critic has fears. If my critic isn't doing this job for me, what would he be fearful would happen? That's the question that unearths that um answer for people. So like when they ask their critic, so if you don't show up for me the way that you show up for me, what might you think will happen? Well, like, my critic straight up will say that, you're gonna fail, right? If I
Mm,
don't push you, you're going to fail.
mhm,
So I have a critic that can show up around visibility, which of course was functional until, like, I started to think about developing an online community for my work, which then meant that my work had to come outside of the therapy room and more into the space of sort of kind of like online working, because I wanted to reach more people. And my critic would sort of kind of really hone in on mistakes, typos, and like bring up memories of people shaming me. Obviously, I went to sort of kind of very strict schools where, you get called up if you've done something wrong, or if you fail, if you got, we used to get lined up in terms of like my primary school, high school as well. Like, you knew what set you were based on how well you are. And those memories sort of kind of were still what my critic was running on. And I think that's sort of kind of that second part of that job. Once we start to get to understand our critic and we start to understand the fears, that's the work that we do, is to help our critic know
exactly.
that actually those time when you showed up to protect me, I didn't need to be in those situations. I didn't need, like I think schooling system failed me now. That like I was a child, I was meant to make mistake. Learning, like I never learned to fail. I went to
Mm,
schools that never really advocated failure. And I
mhm,
was failed for not learning to fail and for sort of avoiding failure throughout my life. And now sort of kind of having to sort of repair. And the repair work is what we need to do so that we take the burden off our critic that actually no, it's okay to fail. We need to sort of kind of rewrite, you know, like rewrite this learning, and heal these wounds that's attached to failure.
mm,
Whatever wound is attached to our fears that the critic is holding on to, that's what we need to work with.
mm,
And that comes from having that relationship with our critic to sort of say, well, I don't want you to vacate your role, but equally, like the way in which you're showing up for me is not necessarily bringing 100% effectiveness. Can we work together in a way in which, this is what I want to achieve, or this is how I want you to show up for me? So if you're not showing up in this way, what would you be afraid would happen? That's when we get to this sort of kind of root of the problem. And I think this is why this work is much more powerful when we do it with another person that is able to guide us. Like to work with our inner critic, we don't need to go and buy anything. We don't need to go outside of ourselves to heal those
mm,
wounds. But sometimes we just need another person to help
yeah.
guide us, internally, to help us sort of kind of map out that emotional landscape to be able to
Mm,
reach where did it start. Another way of sort of kind of like thinking about that is really thinking, when did this part of you show up for you? At what point in your life did that come? Because oftentimes our critics show up when we don't have our needs met, whether it's our needs for unconditional love, unconditional care. Like I said, my own need for sort of, I don't know what emotional need it is to sort of kind of guide a child that to tell a child that it's okay for them to fail, but appropriate guidance and emotional safety, emotional containment. And the critic gets developed because that's what
mm,
happens, right? Like his survival is something that our mind is going to do, and it will go to sort of extreme places. So when we are able to understand that, when did this part of me come along, and we're able to ask, what exactly was I needing? If I had a child right now, and this thing happened to them that brought on an inner critic, what would I be giving to my child instead?
mm.
Mm,
Yes,
mm,
wonderful. Because you're touching on so many important points there, which is one, it's that self-compassion of being able to like understand that obviously this inner critic is trying to help you, but it's
mhm,
not always doing it in a
mhm,
way that is actually super helpful.
mhm,
And if we can sort of work with the fears of the inner critic and be able
mhm,
to find a way to listen and understand those fears and
mhm,
also transform those fears so that they're
mhm,
no longer um, holding us back, as you say, like that
mhm,
fear of failure, which is so common.
mhm,
And as you say, we kind of get conditioned into through the education system to kind
mhm,
of really feel like failure is such a bad thing,
mhm,
when in
mhm,
fact failure is necessary in order to
mhm.
succeed. Like if you're
Yeah.
not failing, then you're not taking risks and you're not
No.
trying things, and just being able to shift that perspective and shift those
Mhm,
fears is huge, because
mhm,
once we work with those, again, with the fears of the critic, we, as you say, we're able to transform, and that voice of the
mhm,
inner critic begins to be acknowledged, and it alleviates,
mhm,
that kind of drive,
mhm,
like, you this, and you
mhm,
got to do
mhm,
better,
mhm,
because yeah, it's I think, why I think part of the reason why we have so much of this inner criticism is because we tend to be taught most of the time that it is bad to fail, and we end up learning that we have to always
mhm.
win and we have to always succeed. So
Yeah.
really, really important to be able to shift those fears,
Mhm, mhm,
and
mhm.
to bring in that compassion. And even
Yeah.
you mentioned as well that you can work with these parts of yourself,
Mhm,
where you
mhm,
can
mhm,
say, there's a part of me that feels really critical, there's a part of me that feels really criticized, but there could
mhm.
be a part of me that's very compassionate and
Oh
can
yeah.
observe what's happening and be able
Mhm,
to distill some wisdom and some love
mhm, mhm,
to these other parts of me that are like super afraid
mhm, mhm,
or feeling super vulnerable and just
mhm.
just wanting to do well,
Absolutely.
essentially.
Absolutely. Because at one point or another, when your critic came along, um, whatever the fear it was protecting you from was threatening to your
Yeah,
survival. Um, and I know, like, we can see it here now and look back and sort of kind of think like, oh, well, I wouldn't have died if my critic didn't show up. But actually, it could have been threatening to your attachment system. So if I didn't do this well, like, my mom or my dad or like, the adults in my life who, we strongly attach, and attachment is about sort of kind of like survival, right? That could have
yeah,
been really impacted. So the fears back then are so huge. It might not look huge now, but you wouldn't have known because you're a child, or like, you didn't have that capacity, you didn't have those resources. There's much more powerlessness and helplessness around in those sort of kind of like earlier times, that your critic was the thing that showed up to sort of kind of give you that sense of control. And so he holds a space, and you can't just vacate that space without filling it up with something else. So definitely compassion. It is, I know like there's a lot of messages out there like compassion is that antidote or whatever to shame and criticism, but it can be very difficult for us to develop that compassion for ourselves. Like one of the things that I often sort of say to my client when we're exploring the critic is when they start to get to know their critic, and I'm like, would you allow your critic to teach 5-year-olds in school? And they're like, oh gosh, no, 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 never. And it's so eye-opening for
mm-hmm.
them because they would never let that part of themselves out,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that shows that actually we already have that inner capacity for compassion for other people. We have capacity for compassion. We just don't. It's just like it just needs to be able to, you know, come on,
Yeah,
turn it to ourselves.
yes,
So it's not
and it's
like it's missing in any way.
exactly, and it's so much easier, I think, for many people to say, like, I can have compassion towards
Hmm.
someone that I really love, or my
Hmm.
children, or my
Hmm.
family, but then it's like, but what about yourself? Like,
Hmm.
do you have that for yourself too, or are
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
excluding yourself
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
from being able to give yourself what you naturally would give to
Hmm.
other people you love?
Hmm.
So it that that relationship that we have with ourselves is so important, because it's the foundation of everything, in terms of how we experience the world. So absolutely, like, this whole aspect of being able to work with the relationship with yourself, which involves as you say, integrating all these different parts of
Mhm,
us and working with the critic is so important, because without that, we are oftentimes operating from these survival strategies
mhm,
that
mhm,
we learned when we were younger, where it was like, no, I have to be perfect in order,
mhm,
to get some of my needs met, or I
mhm,
have to act a certain way, or
mhm,
I have to avoid certain things, or I have to people
mhm,
please, and
mhm,
and then those things just don't no longer serve us
mhm,
anymore. When we become adults, and then we have to
mhm,
unlearn all of that and learn
mhm,
better ways to show up for ourselves. So it's a process as well. It's definitely not something that um, happens just overnight, right? Because again, you could be holding on to these patterns for years and years and years, but you absolutely can transform these things,
mhm,
and you
mhm,
absolutely can change the way that you relate to yourself, the way that you experience that inner critic. And it doesn't have to stop you from being able to go out there and actually do the things that you want to do, to be vulnerable, to take risks, to elevate to another level. So I think it's super important that people really understand that the relationship with yourself is the foundation of everything,
mhm,
right? How
mhm,
we also
mhm,
relate
mhm,
to others.
mhm,
And yeah, and it's so important to work on that. So um, it's a huge topic, and I feel like we've been going a bit across the board, looking at all these aspects of how to bring in self compassion. And I want to talk a little.
mm, mm, mm,
Different
mm.
way than I did previously.
Ye-
And I think your
Yeah,
connection's again. I hope it's gonna
I
get
I
better.
think that, yeah, I
Apologies,
think your
it's a bit
connection, is it
choppy. I
your
don't know
connection or
why.
is it mine? It's something. Okay.
I don't know. I hope it's. I hope it's.
Yeah. Okay. So your question is what's changed for me, like in terms of like dealing with the critic? I think I started with it's been different things. Like I think definitely developing an inner compassionate part of me.
Yeah.
Um really helped a lot. I started to think more from that. So I started to rely more on my compassionate image. Like, I developed like a compassionate image outside of myself first. That was sort of kind of my work with compassion took years as well. Like over 3 years, like I was working, like learning compassion focused therapy, which I was immersing myself into that modality and sort of kind of working with compassion in general. I understood compassion. I think I believed in compassion. And like the different transformative ways in which I was able to invite compassion, more compassion into my life, like, transform that because I then
Mm,
believed more in compassion being in the power of compassion.
mm,
And I think it's different for everybody. So how do we invite compassion into our life? Definitely, like there are strategies that were helpful for me from compassion focused therapy, but became transformative, like in the way in which I use these sort of kind of strategies. I think I know also sort of kind of like my inner critic, like just that getting to know it. I know I have an awareness of when it starts to show up. And again, everyone's journey is different. But I don't think we can work with it without having that sort of kind of like our inner capacity for compassion for ourselves is there. It gets sort of I think I use different words to explain. Sometimes we get when we're not connected to ourself, our sense of self, our essence, it's difficult to we just living in autopilot. We just sort of kind of like our brain is we're just in survival mode. We're just in different sort of kind of parts of our mind. But it's really being able to connect to our sense of self, like
mm,
that sort of kind of compassionate, that sort of kind of self that isn't. fear driven or fear based, that is curious, that is compassionate, that is playful, that part of us can really help us when we engage about critic from that part. And to do that work, I think, like I said, it's different ways. I think most people that I work with, they're not able to start there. They're not able to, they don't have that capacity, whether that be, it's in them, they just need support to connect with it,
Mm,
right? Like
absolutely.
don't think we don't buy compassion from outside of us, because we already are, like, most people that I work with, they're fantastic. They're the people with other people. They have compassion, so much compassion for other people.
Mhm.
They're sort of kind of like, really there for other people. They would never judge themselves the same, the same way the critical mindset judges them. So is how do we connect that? Like, I think that's like, how do you do that in your practice? How do I do that in my practice? I think there are sort of kind of several ways to get there. But that's where we need to get to be able to
Yes.
sort of kind of turn. I always see compassion as having three flows. So compassion for other people is one flow. um, Compassion from other people to us. So sort of, like if I come to you, and I've been to you a few times for a few issues that I've sort of kind of like had, been facing in my life. So I've been able to draw compassion from you. My ability to be able to take that, that's another channel. Because other people can give us compassion and we can't take it. Right. So
Mm,
like, you might be sort of kind of like trying to offer me compassion, and that channel is completely blocked. And then the last flow, or like, the other flow of compassion, is our ability to give that to ourselves. And most people often have that flow where they give compassion to other people established. And there's science behind this, that is very natural for human to sort of kind of like altruism, and to sort of kind of
yeah.
give compassion to other people. To get it depend on our experiences that we've had in life. But it's also more easier for people to be able to derive compassion. That channel is also kind of, more open and accessible to other people than
Mm,
the self to self compassion flow. And often is experiences that have blocked that, because I don't think anyone is born not being able to give compassion to themselves. And I think that's what we need to unpack and unpick, is what's going on there.
absolutely. So important what you're saying. And this taps into, I think, this one other point I just want to make before we open up to some Q&As is um, this concept of like really being your own advocate and being your own best friend, because I think so often we have been conditioned to rely on getting our sense of self from other people, and we
Mm-hmm,
do turn so much externally of like, what does this
mm-hmm,
person think of me,
mm-hmm,
or
mm-hmm,
like, what does my boss think of me, or if I put something out there, what does my audience think? And we really get focused so much on, yeah, what others are thinking of us and how are they, judging us or
mm-hmm,
praising us. And really, when you tune into being your own empowered best friend, your own like true advocate, then you're able to really navigate, I think, the not being so attached to, whether or not somebody really thinks highly of you or not. I mean, you obviously, we're always going to care because we're social beings, so
mm-hmm,
we're always going to care. But I think it's absolutely so important to really like have such a loving and accepting opinion of yourself, and that also means messing up, like
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
not being too critical when we
Yeah.
mess up, because we're humans
I think we
and we're all gonna,
have to be deliberate, actually. If you have
yeah,
a fear of failure or a fear of making mistake, you have to be deliberate about learning how to fail. I'm saying that from experience. I think what I'm learning, like that's my exercise for myself this year, is I have a fear of rejection as well, very
yeah,
strong. And I'm deliberately knocking on doors, and sort of kind of really, not only I'm not knocking on doors that will sort of kind of shut out at me, but I wasn't sort of knocking on doors before, so I wouldn't approach people to say, can I come on your podcast, or can I feature on this, or can I, like ask for collaboration, because I don't want a no. um but I'm actually like I'm doing that more, but really what I'm doing is when I do get a no or no response, I'm holding myself in those moments because I'm activated, I'm triggered.
Mm,
And I'm knowing that like my triggers isn't about the people that aren't saying the no, it's from other things. So I'm really sort of kind of holding that. And I'm sort of kind of putting content out there and I'm having typos and like I went through periods where I'm like, oh my God. And the critic is really
yeah.
like, oh my God, people are gonna judge your grammar and like, you're supposed to sort of be educated. Why? Look at the age, look at this and
Mm,
take a deep breath, don't fix that typo. It's like I'm not fixing that type. I'm not going back to
yeah,
rewrite it. I'm
exactly.
shortening the time because the solution is to tolerate that. So
Hmm.
I actually think, and sort of I know you work with creatives, that that's part of healing. The part of
Hmm.
healing is being able to actually like know that it's not about that fear. It's not about not making mistake. Actually, like maybe you need to think, I wasn't allowed to make so much mistake. I actually need to know how to make mistake. I wasn't allowed to fail. Why don't you get that into that opportunity as well? And sort of, I think the healing happens, right? Like if we think about it, our subconscious works on repetition plus sort of kind of the emotion. The more we repeat that, and no one died. In fact, people will still comment on posts where typos have been made because they got it.
Yeah,
Like, people get the message. People aren't worried about sort of kind of like, what I wrote. Somehow them,
exactly.
yeah.
Mm,
And I'm learning, and I think that's been a profound shift for me this year. Like, that like, okay, visibility thing, we managed it. I'm not dead,
mm,
right? So I'm telling my subconscious, look, did we die? We didn't die. And I think that's
no,
really healing, like particularly that actually if we have a fear of failure, maybe it's not about avoiding failure. And really it is about being intentional. It's not that fear isn't going to come or all those feelings aren't going to come, or it's how do we stay with ourselves? Like when we needed that, we perhaps didn't get that. And now we can be that for ourselves. So that's something that hopefully helps someone listening.
yes, 100%, 100%. So, I want to encourage if you guys have questions, I'm gonna just read off Matt's question. But if there's any other questions that you have, we're just gonna take a few moments to answer any questions that may come up. And Matt's saying, is it helpful to give the inner critic an affectionate or funny name? I would say
I've had
yes.
people do it. Yeah, I've had people do it. Like, I think it's sort of like, yeah, I actually like, yes, someone, yeah, like a piece of work that I did came to mind. Yeah, it builds that relationship. It's what resonates with you. I've also had people sort of just say, no, I don't know. And, we've just not named it, we just called it the critic. But yeah, absolutely. Like, it's in getting into it. My critic is called Stella.
Stella the
So
critic.
yeah, my critic is Costello is just like, when I'm sort of when she's very active and going
Mm,
off, I can know like I just have that relationship and I can have that inner dialogue is sort of kind of easier for me to spot. So yeah, absolutely. Find what works for you.
yeah.
But definitely it's one way of building that relationship with your critic.
Yeah, yeah. Fantastic. Fantastic. So, and I agree. I agree. We can it's like when you give this part of you a name or like a certain avatar or something, it kind of
Hmm.
becomes
Hmm.
almost like something that you can relate to. You can
Hmm.
choose how you
Hmm.
relate. It's like, okay, Stella, how, I hear
Hmm.
you, but
Hmm.
today,
Hmm. Hmm.
uh, um, I'm not necessarily going to let you stop me from, taking the risk
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
putting something out
Hmm.
there, right?
Hmm.
So um, it's a really helpful tool. And I think Francesca's also asking here, what do you think about self-compassion through physical touch? So I think that is also great. It's a great tool because we we tend to regulate our system when we get, for example, hugs, right, from other
Mhm,
people.
mhm,
So
mhm,
why
mhm,
not
mhm,
give yourself, for example,
mhm,
a hug and be able
mhm, mhm,
to, yeah, just take some time to slow down or,
mhm,
be able
mhm.
to use that as a self-soothing way
Yeah,
to regulate.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Especially and if you have someone who can do that with you as well, co-regulation is definitely like we react as human beings because we're like wired for connection with other people. When we co-regulate with other people, like almost our nervous system is more reactive to that. And if there's nobody, like self hugs or tapping,
Yeah.
can be very, very helpful. Or visualizing someone who is very compassionate. So working on compassion, I had a compassionate imagery that, like, I would work with. That's like that compassion flowing from someone to me, and it really helped me develop my own inner compassion um, part as
Mm,
well.
amazing. Yeah. And I'm Poppet says, I have a fear of success and responsibility, accountability that comes from exposure and success, and the fear I wouldn't be able to consistently deliver. How can I over to pursue my ambition? So this is really interesting because we talk about fear of failure, but there's also a fear of success. Like, what if I
Mm-hmm,
do make
mm,
it?
mm-hmm,
Right?
mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
what action am I going to be able to handle that level of success?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
and that's another fear that we have to, when that fear comes up, when we recognize it, it's so important to then be able to work with it and transform it. And I mean, one of the
mm-hmm,
things that I find can be really helpful is to like to challenge the fear, but to create a declaration or create a
mm-hmm,
truth that can replace that particular story that
mm-hmm,
you begin to give more attention to.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And when you begin to look for the evidence that supports that new truth, like I can
mm-hmm,
handle success, and maybe I won't be perfect, like I might,
mm-hmm,
maybe have a few mess ups, or I might at
mm-hmm,
times feel overwhelmed, but that's still me moving forward. It's still part of my
mm-hmm,
journey. And I
mm-hmm,
can begin to see more and more evidence that shows
mm-hmm,
me that actually I can do this. I can handle this. It's going to be a learning curve,
mm-hmm,
right? I'm not going to
mm-hmm,
like master this right away, but I'm going to take
mm-hmm,
one step forward at a time and be
mm-hmm,
able to
mm-hmm,
see that I am making progress and getting better. And
mm-hmm,
eventually it's going to become super comfortable. Like I can share, like from my own experience, that like stepping into creating films when I've been so used to doing clinical work, there's a part of me that also is like, this is new, this is novel, there's a
mm-hmm,
huge learning curve.
mm-hmm,
Am I going to do this? And if it's successful, then it's like,
mm-hmm,
well, exactly.
mm-hmm. I
What
think,
then? Like
yeah, I actually think,
how
yeah, yeah. You you froze a little bit again. Sorry, I'm struggling to hear you, but
mm, oh, we're losing you.
okay.
Are you back?
Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. No, I was just echoing what you were saying. And like I just had a thought that I think often fear of success is underrated, or under talked about. And I think it can come hand in hand with fear of failure as well. Not being able to sort of handle the attention that our success gives us. Because I think you were talking about your experience there, and I'm thinking, as much as I worry about the typos around visibility, I also worry so much about the recognition. Like I do sort of kind of experience a kind of
Mm,
visceral physiological reaction, especially like, if I do a post and then, oh my God, like I remember that. And I'm just wondering now, like, about how interlinked those two fears are. But we often talk about fear of failure, but we never really talk about fear of success. So that's a very useful
mm,
question and
it,
something to consider. I
absolutely.
wonder
So,
whether it's the same fear. But I'll wait.
syndrome heard of, which is it's the voice of also like, who do you think you are, right? Who do you think you are to go out
Sorry, say
there
that again.
and that sense of like
I
not
can't.
being
I
able
still
to,
can't hear you. Can you?
yeah, just want to have a, but we're working with it. So I was just talking about the tall poppy syndrome that was highlighting, which is the sense of like, the voice that says like, who do you think you are? Like, who do you
Mm-hmm.
think you are to be successful, to
Mm-hmm.
accomplish? And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and that's also like important to work with that too, and to recognize that who are you not to? Like your light,
Absolutely. I.
your
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
if you want to have more as going after their dreams, we wouldn't have so many beautiful creations that we do in the world. So we need to have the courage to be able to step into our highest desire, also giving permission for other people to be able to do
Mm.
the same, because people see, okay, if she can do
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it, and
Mm.
really stay persistent, stay committed. Um, that's all I want to say. I think anything else you want to add to that, Tammy, before we sort of wrap up our
I
convo
think,
today?
I'm just thinking about that sort of kind of question, and I think oftentimes there's sort of kind of like similar fears, failure and success, and oftentimes it might be a fear of us tapping into our authenticity, just fear of being us, fear of being who we are. And it is, I
Exactly.
think the more we step into working and connecting with who we are, um, the more we're able to, I suppose, work hand in hand with courage with those fears of either success or failure.
100%, 100%. And I'm inspired when people are really super
Hmm.
authentic, and it's just, having the courage to be messy too, and to not be
Hmm.
perfect. I think it really just shows us that, you know, that's what's real, and being human
Hmm.
is about being on that journey of life,
Yeah.
and navigating all these different things that we navigate. But ultimately, when we see somebody persistent and courageous, it's really inspiring because it shows us what's possible. So um, I just want to thank everybody that tuned in, and difficulties. Let us know that, especially for creatives and creators who I love to work with, if you do feel like in the next year you want to step up, like you want 2025 to be your year where you're really out there and you're stepping into those goals, those dreams, and you don't want to have fear hold you back, or you don't want to have your inner critic hold you back. Really, really important that you do reach out and get some support. And I'm actually offering this week, before we get into Christmas, I do book some calls with me where we get to go through your choice making patterns, and we get to see what are the fears that are holding that. Send me a DM with the word discovery, and I'm going to reach out to you. We can have a chat and we can book that in. So there's only a few spots available, so really, really take advantage of this if you want to jump into 2025 and be like ready to just go out there, be your authentic self, and go after your dreams. And
Hmm.
Tammy, I want
Hmm.
to thank you for joining. Thanks
My
so much.
absolute pleasure.
for being a part of this conversation. How can people find
My
you, and
absolute pleasure.
where can they tune into you if they want to work with you, if they want to, get more
Yeah, I'm on
resources for?
Instagram. I'm not sure, like I have the same sort of it's jumpy, but I hope you finish talking because it was breaking before. But yeah, people can find me on
Did you hear what I asked
Instagram.
you, or
Yeah, it
was there a
was a I
delay?
think there was a delay. Yeah, people can find me on Instagram. I do sort of post stuff around trauma and finding your sense of self, self-worth in particular on Instagram. I'm also on LinkedIn. And I next year, I'm working on getting to meet your inner critic workshop. So have a look out for that. If you, I mean, give me a follow and you will sort of get the details when I put that work out there. But it's been lovely talking to you guys.
Amazing. It's been so good to have this conversation. Jumping in on the last bit, and you want to have a replay, again, just send me a message with the word replay, and I can send you the replay so you can tune into this conversation fully. And wishing everybody a good rest of the week. And remember to tune in and be compassionate with yourself this week, especially as we get into the busy holiday season. And we'll see you guys next time. Thanks
Yeah,
again.
thanks for joining us. Thank you, everyone. Bye now. Bye.
Bye.